Hello and welcome to the 538 Politics Podcast. I'm Galen Druk.
I'm Nate Silver.
And this is Model Talk. Of course, Model Talk is where we ask and answer questions about 538's forecasts. The first of which is, Nate, how's the Senate model coming along?
LOL out loud. It's coming soon.
All right.
Yeah, I'm curious. And again, people are like, so what's it actually say? I don't know until the end what it's going to say. One thing I'm really curious about is how it's going to handle all these races where you have really red states with Democratic incumbents, because there's not a lot of polling in some of those states, and so the quote-unquote fundamentalist calculation will be important. But I have no idea what it's going to say.
So since we don't have the Senate model for this episode of Model Talk, we are going to continue to talk about the 2018 House forecast model, and we have a lot of questions.
Can I just say one thing? It's going to trip people out. It's all just one model, man. The Senate model and the House are just going to be one model, man. There's going to be a Congress model.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I mean, are you just like f***ing with me, or are they coupled in a way that the Senate model is reliant on?
I was so happy when I realized it the other day. It's just one model. There's a Congress model. So, for example, one thing we really like is polls that list results among both registered voters and likely voters. Mm-hmm. You can make inferences for what that means for the House from Senate polls that do that and vice versa, right? We can also kind of jointly estimate what are the chances that Democrats win neither chamber, one but not the other. So there are lots of cool things you can do to make the model more robust.
Okay, but you're essentially using all the same algorithms. You're just applying it to a different
Yeah, I mean,
matrix.
there are a few things to look at. You know, is the incumbency advantage about the same in the House and the Senate? Probably, yeah, but we'll investigate that. But basically, it's like the things that we found in the House model this year are kind of all things that have inherently worked in the past in the Senate forecast that we've issued every other year. And so we're literally just going to encode them as one model. So at some point, hopefully, I think late next week, we will have the Senate model be calculated as well, and we'll go up, and then yeah. Governors might be separate.
All right.
When we get around to the govs.
Well, we got a lot of questions about the House forecast, and we're going to get to some of those. But before we do, just a few general points. What has your reaction been to the first 2 weeks of the House forecast being live? Is there anything that surprised you about how they responded to new data?
I mean, I have like two answers to this. I'm not sure which one to give, right? First of all, with the House forecast, you have 435 races, a lot of moving parts, and there was more debugging, frankly, than we've needed in the past with the House forecast or with the presidential forecast, right? Where every type of unusual race, so Louisiana, where you have multiple candidates running, right? Races where you have one Democrat against an independent candidate, right? Races where actually you're having a primary just this week. There were definitely more things in the model that weren't working like they were supposed to or that we expected them to, not for good reasons, but because like we had never actually kind of seen what the code looks like live, right? So the attitude kind of for the first week is, okay, if the model shows something weird, then let's actually make sure that that's not a bug, right? And so we can talk a little bit about why. So those changes mostly affected the light version of the model, which shifted not because of the underlying data, but because we did some debugging, which I'll explain. Yeah,
this gets to a question that we got a lot from listeners, which is that on August 20th, Democrats' chances of taking the House, according to the light forecast, dropped by about 10 points. So are you saying that that was a bug fix and not that something fundamentally changed?
Right.
Okay.
What happened is that a bunch of polls, so in the House we use partisan polls put out by campaigns or Democratic or Republican organizations, right? A bunch of polls that should have been labeled as partisan were not getting labeled as partisan. And so therefore the model is actually sensitive to that. In some ways it's a good thing that like, oh, the model actually cares if you have a partisan poll or not, right? And it's all Democrats are more enthusiastic. It's all Democrats putting out these partisan polls, right? So if a bunch of the polls that should be partisan are not, it makes a much more mild House effects adjustment. And so it's saying, oh boy, you know, if you forget that all the polls out there, half of them are partisan Democratic polls, then the situation looks a lot better for Democrats, right? It still looks pretty good. Obviously, their favorite's still in light forecast, but that failure to like correctly define the polls as partisan affected the light forecast meaningfully. There was, and it affects light more than it affects the other two because light is polling dependent. At this point, obviously, polling is still a big input in Classic and Deluxe, but there isn't that much polling, and so they won't shift as much yet with the polling. Eventually, they'll all become very polling driven, and so it does not really reflect changes in the underlying environment.
And so going forward, just to make this clear to people, you don't really tweak the model once you publish it in general, unless you're debugging it.
I mean, there's a fine line, right? So we don't make changes in individual races, right? We don't say, oh, I don't like how this is working. But it is like if you buy a new couch and you can spec out how the couch is going to look in your home.
Okay.
And this is very personal, I suppose, right?
You just buy a new couch?
Well, let's not get into the dynamics of my relationship. But
okay.
But you buy a new couch, there's just going to be some things that no matter how much you try and anticipate in advance, you're not going to be able to anticipate until you actually put it in the setting of your living room and see how it interacts with the rest of the furniture, right? And so my philosophy has kind of gone from the first year in 2008, where the first time I ever had a model, we would constantly kind of add features. It was very like, blah, 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 let's iterate and iterate and iterate, right? To being very about, okay, once we kind of release the model, it's done and we'll never touch it, right? You know, I've kind of come with somewhere in between, but the basic philosophy is that, like, I tend to look at the first week or two as kind of a beta period where you see if things are reacting how they're supposed to react, because you're now, you know, you're committing, therefore, to being potentially out on a limb for the rest of the year, right? So it's like, you know, so the other change that we made that's a kind of wholesale change and not a piecemeal change. Piecemeal means like, okay, this weird type of race, the code wasn't working correctly, but it only affected a few races, right? We noticed that the model was shifting a lot based on individual generic ballot polls that would come in. And so I went back and looked at, is this, because you have to set parameters for how much do you adjust the generic ballot average based on a new poll. Really what it is how large a span of data do you use in calculating an average? Do you use 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months, whatever else, right?
And what did you settle on?
We found that, well, it depends. So it gets more aggressive as you get closer to the election date, right? But we found that for the generic ballot, using a fairly slow-moving average is optimal. So the model will now react less aggressively to 1 or 2 new generic ballot polls coming in. If you do see a big shift in the overall trend, right, if all of a sudden there are 4 or 5 polls that show Democrats up 10 points instead of 7, that will have an effect. And the generic ballot's a very important thing. But we don't think it should generally be reacting to individual generic ballot polls that much, although still, you know, to go from like 73% to 75%, I mean, that can happen. That's not that big a shift, though, right?
Right. And just to give people a sense of where the forecast is right now, the light version shows 3 out of 5, 60%. The classic version shows 3 out of 4, 75%. And the deluxe version shows 5 out of 7, which is roughly 72%. Is my math correct?
But you don't have to do the
But you don't have to do the math. So one question I have for you is, how do you feel so far about how the forecast expresses uncertainty? We switched to expressing uncertainty in a fraction instead of a percentage to the closest tenth of a point. How do you feel about that?
I like it. I mean, first of all, it essentially rounds us off to the nearest couple of percentage points, right? And so therefore, like, people aren't worrying as much about if it goes from 74% to 72%. They just feel like rounder, and I think it kind of expresses the inherent degree of precision that you actually have in a model well. And I can go back and forth on this point, but like, I was reading about this today for some reason. It's a little bit like in an NFL game where you have like the down markers, and where they spot the football after Odell Beckham is tackled is completely arbitrary, right? Maybe it's within half a yard on average, right? Then they'll very precisely measure, like, bring out the chain, see whether he got a first down or not. It's a little bit like if the uncertainty in how you're kind of building the model swamps like this very, you know, not fake precision per se, right? But then it's better to have somewhat rounder numbers, we think. And I think the reaction to it, I mean, look, for better or worse, it is easier to explain the uncertainty when you say there's a 1 in 4 chance or a 3 in 10 chance. By the way, you know who else had a 3 in 10 chance of becoming?
I have no idea, Nate. Tell me.
Donald Trump. Donald Trump, current president. So it's like a little bit easier to explain in some ways, I think.
Okay, I want to talk about one more thing before we get to listener questions, and that is North Carolina. So a 3-judge panel in North Carolina ruled on Monday that North Carolina's congressional map is an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander. People who have listened to this podcast for a while know that we've covered gerrymandering plenty. The court ordered that the map be redrawn ahead of the 2018 election. Are you taking that as a given and adjusting the model now, or are we going to wait and see how this plays out?
No, because, I mean, we wouldn't even have information on, like, what the districts are,
right,
or how in the hell this process would work. Yeah, so as you've been tweeting about.
It is a messy process.
There is a chance that North Carolina will say, we need new congressional districts this year. And what I think would probably happen then is they would say, we will hold the primary in November, and then a month later, 6 weeks later, we'll have the runoff, which sounds cockamamie. This actually was used in Texas in 1996 before, and so there's a chance that North Carolina, number one, they'll have new districts and new candidates, right? I guess they'll nullify the results of the previous primaries or something, right? And number two, they'll probably have a multi-stage voting process like they lose in Louisiana. So, one good thing is that because we have to write that code anyway for Louisiana, which has a primary actually on November 6th, and then holds general election 5 or 6 weeks later, if North Carolina does that, then we have the code ready to go to simulate this rather complex primary/runoff process. But for now,
no changes.
We wouldn't even know how to account for that.
Right. I mean, you can average, say, that if this was a less partisan map, Democrats might win 2 more seats, but obviously
so maybe
not worth it at this point.
Well, the other thing, too, is sometimes you hear people say, okay, this, I heard someone say, this Duncan Hunter race could be pivotal to the House. That's the wrong mentality for the House because, our forecast range as of 3:22 p.m. on Wednesday runs from Democrats winning 14 seats to 56 seats. And that's only the middle 80% of the range. There's a 20% chance it'll be outside that range. That's a really large range, right? And so
to pretend that 1 or 2 races
if you want to talk about false precision, if you say, oh, this one race shifted and all of a sudden that cost, it's no, probably not. We're probably not going to hit it right on the nose. We're probably going to be either things slip a little bit back toward Republicans and they either hold the House or come really close, or things shift a little more toward Democrats all of a sudden, 40, 45, 50 seats, right? Even more potentially. And so it's you shouldn't sweat individual races all that much. What you can do is look at races that allow you to make inferences about other races. So, for example, there was a poll that came out the other day in, let me get the district right, but it was John Katko's district in Syracuse, the 24th district. And he is a guy who is in a district that Hillary Clinton won, but who won his race by 20 points in 2016. So a Republican incumbent who really outperforms the fundamentals in his race. So a poll from Siena came out that showed Katko up by 15 points, which is one of the best polls the GOP's had in any race, right? Mm-hmm. So the model, that actually shifted the overall forecast for a couple different reasons, right? One is that Siena is a good nonpartisan pollster. You don't necessarily get that many good nonpartisan polls, especially before Labor Day, of individual districts. So it said, okay, there was another poll in that district, a PPP poll, and PPP is polling, public policy polling. They have issued polls in probably 40 districts, right? And that poll had the Democratic opponent ahead. So it's saying, okay, maybe all these PPP polls are a little bit suspect. If a good nonpartisan poll comes in and says, actually, not only is she not winning, she's losing by 15 points, right? So that would color its judgment about all the PPP polls. It also says, hey, look, maybe Republican incumbents are a little stronger than we would have thought previously, right? So that was an important poll that actually, not radically, right, but affected the forecasts in every race with a Republican incumbent a little bit, or every race with a PPP poll. And combined, those are actually quite a few races. And so you can see the model, in my view, doing what it was supposed to do, which is making smart inferences from one data point toward other data points.
Yeah, and so while this North Carolina episode may not change all that much about how we think about the House, I do at some point want to have a conversation. Maybe we'll have a debate or some roundtable and debate the actual effect of gerrymandering on the result of the midterms in general, because, that's obviously less specific to individual districts and more just kind of a general trend. But we can save that for another day because we have a lot of questions from listeners. We're going to answer some of them. But before we do that, let me tell you that this episode of Model Talk is brought to you by Casper Mattress. Casper was created with one goal in mind: deliver a great night's sleep at an incredible value. The team of engineers and designers at Casper works nonstop, researching, prototyping, and testing all of their mattresses based on how different people sleep. The Casper mattress has a unique combination of foams that provide the right pressure relief and alignment so you feel perfectly balanced and comfortable. And thanks to the breathable material, you're guaranteed to sleep cool. Plus, the mattresses are built to last for years. Try Casper yourself for 100 nights in your own home, risk-free. They ship it to you for free in a compact box. If you don't love it, you don't have to put it back in that tiny box. They'll come and pick it up and refund you everything, no questions asked. See for yourself why Casper has over 35,000 five-star reviews and counting. That's based on reviews of all Casper products across Casper, Google, and Amazon. Go to Casper.com today to take advantage of Casper's limited-time Labor Day offer. Say goodbye to summer with 10% off any order with a mattress. Terms and conditions apply. See the site for details. Nate, is that making you tired?
I mean, it's a little weird to have a mattress podcast ad in a period where I don't sleep enough, but,
They're just rubbing it in.
Yeah.
Although, maybe if you had a Casper mattress, you would just, you would just push the Senate model of
4.5 hours.
You would spend more time on that mattress. Anyway, let's get back to it. Are you ready for some listener questions?
I suppose.
All right.
I mean, I'm here.
That's the kind of attitude I like. So, first one, Daniel asks, and I think this might be a kind of perennial question, but we should definitely answer it. I am curious if in the model you're calculating the potential for coattails, either positive or negative, from governor and Senate races on down ballot races like House races. We got a similar question. I'll just put it out there from Rihanna. I don't know if that's her actual name. I kind of don't think it is, but that was her name on Twitter. She said, how do ballot issues like marijuana legalization or bail reform affect turnout and therefore impact the model? So in general, how do other factors that are not specific to one race impact it?
They don't. It's the pollster's job to get an accurate sample, and if the sample is larger because you have more people excited about a governor's race or a Senate race, and they're therefore going to vote in the House race, then hopefully that's incorporated in the poll. But we do not make any specific adjustment where we say, oh, Beto O'Rourke is running, and therefore Democrats will be more excited, and therefore this Democrat in Texas, whichever district, will overperform, right? That has to kind of flow down to the poll level. And it's plausible. I mean, you can see the effects. So we do actually model turnout, and turnout just accounts for, is there a House race and is there a Senate race in the state? And turnout is definitely higher in those cases. And so it does suggest that, there are a fair number of voters who will not care about the House race but vote for the House race. One thing a pollster should probably do is make sure to, push their undecided voters, right? If you had to choose, do you vote for the Democrat or the Republican, right? Because a Beto voter might, excuse me, he was in a band?
I did know that he was in a band.
Cooler than what Ted Cruz probably doing.
Who knows? I mean, Ted Cruz probably has some kind of wild experience.
But someone like that might not have thought a lot about the House race, but will nevertheless vote in the House race, and will probably vote the same way they vote in the Senate race, right? And so making sure that if you're a pollster, you push your undecideds, and they aren't reluctant to give an answer because they haven't heard of the candidates as much when they probably will vote along party lines in November. I mean, that's probably a useful thing to do.
Okay, here's another question. Justin asks, is the forecast predictive of an election held today or one held in the future?
It's predictive of an election held on November 6th.
Because we no longer have a nowcast, folks.
We no longer have but no, it is not a nowcast. It is emphatically not a nowcast, and the uncertainty, which is quite wide, partly reflects the fact that this is a forecast of November 6th and not of today.
And then here's a follow-up from Corbin. He asks, when looking back in November, how does someone evaluate the model's performance now? He then says in parentheses, I can elaborate if the question is worded confusingly, but I think what he's saying is after the election is all said and done, if today on August 29th, or this is airing on August 30th, the forecast said this, how, once this is all said and done, should we judge where the forecast was on this day?
Yeah, look, so you should probably judge the forecast over its whole lifespan and not just on election day. Maybe you give it a mulligan for the first week and a half while we're fixing bugs. But yeah, today's forecast is just as valid a prediction as the one we'll make on the day before the election. So if all of a sudden it shows 75, 25, and all of a sudden it shifts to 64 Republican and Republicans win or keep the House, then you should have mixed feelings about the model, right? It shouldn't be like, oh, great, these guys got it right in the end. It's like, yeah, these guys got it right in the end, but they also had it leaning in the wrong direction for part of the year, right? That's one way. The other way is you should, in general, we have these confidence bands. Well, remember, we're using confidence bands that are 80% wide, not 95% wide like you would with a margin of error, right? And so therefore, we do think 1 out of 5 elections can and should fall outside that range. But with that said, in general, those ranges should narrow, most likely. They might narrow in a lopsided way if the forecast becomes more optimistic for Democrats than what's the range we have now, 14 to 57. Maybe that 14 comes up to 23 and the 57 stays steady or something, right? But in general, that range should narrow.
All right. Here's another question. Eric asks, is there a way to see which House candidates have been coded as facing a major scandal? I think he may have been talking about Duncan Hunter, if I had to guess, in California's 50th district, who was indicted. But is there a way for people to see whether or not that has been taken into account?
Soon there will be.
Soon there will be. Okay, we have an answer for you, Eric. All right, let's do a rapid fire round. We'll give answers that are as short as we can. You ready?
Mm-hmm.
Here we go. You mentioned that fundraising is one of the more predictive indicators. Does the House model make any distinction between campaign contributions that come from within a district and those that come from outside of a district?
Nope.
Okay. Here's another. Does the model take into account the significant Democratic overperformance in special elections thus far?
No, although unlike some of the other things, we did look at that, and we found that special election performance is a fairly noisy indicator. For one thing, in presidential years, it hasn't worked at all, right? You've had years where, 2004, I think Democrats had great numbers in special elections. We're outperforming their partisan benchmarks by 10 points, not quite as much as this year, but almost as much. And yet they didn't do particularly well in the race of the House in 2004. Republicans kept the House. And so, over time, we think that's a fairly noisy indicator. With that said, there's a coherent story that when you actually see conditions on the ground, Democrats are going to be more enthusiastic. Maybe pollsters, I don't know, maybe after 2016, pollsters are afraid to show big Democratic margins or something. But the short answer is no. The long answer is no. And empirically, if you look at it, it doesn't really seem to add much value. But at the same time, I do worry that, what if nationwide we are in that huge Democratic enthusiasm environment, that pollsters aren't capturing that, and then Democrats miss to the upside a little bit.
This question is just signed from a millennial. This millennial says, I'm a millennial and I'm under the impression that polls are conducted through landlines. Is this true? If so, there's no way I would take any of them seriously. Maybe 1% of my generation uses landlines.
Of my generation.
Should I have done that in a millennial voice? I'm sorry.
More vocal fry. So, my generation.
From a millennial.
Question from a millennial. Very few polls, this is one of the good trends in the polling industry, very few polls now don't call landlines, except for robopolls. But most of the robopolls now supplement their samples with also samples they conduct on the internet or via text messages to mobile phones.
You said very few don't call landlines. Do you mean very few don't call cell phones?
Very few don't call cell phones, right? You either have live caller polls, which are the weighted highest in their model, which do almost all of them call cell phones, or you have robopolls, which often also use an online sample, or you have online polls, right? And so this issue of pollsters missing voters who do not have landlines is probably less of an issue than it used to be. With that said, you talk a lot about fighting the last war. I sometimes worry that pollsters will make a lot of adjustments that try to prevent the type of error that they had in 2016 and therefore make new types of errors which perhaps would work in the opposite direction. So,
we are still in the rapid fire round.
Okay. I've not been obeying the rapid fire-ness.
Here's another. Christopher asks, are you running any internal models that are different from the live ones to see how they turn out for future reference, even just for curiosity's sake?
No.
Okay. And we are down to our final question for this episode of Model Talk, and it comes from someone that people might know. His name is actually Rush Limbaugh. So
just call him Rush.
Just call him Rush. Yeah, we've been calling everyone else by their first name. So here's a little context. After the last episode of Model Talk, Rush Limbaugh played some of the audio from our episode on his radio show and didn't seem to be too impressed by some of your explanations about the uncertainty or
by the way,
the forecast.
I listened to Rush Limbaugh as a kid.
You did?
Because I would listen to a lot of live sports, and whichever networks I listen to a lot of live sports on, they often tend to have talk radio programming, and I was too lazy to change the channel, so yeah.
Well, long-time listener.
Long-time listener.
So here is what Rush had to say or ask about the classic forecast that showed the Democrats with a 75% chance of winning the House.
Okay, now, so what good is the 75% chance the Democrats win if you then say it's not far-fetched to think the Republicans can hold the House? How do those two go together? 75%, I'll tell you, because they said the same thing about Hillary winning, and look what happened. They're now not trusting their data.
They're literally synonymous, right? That a 1 in 4 chance is a pretty freaking likely occurrence.
Mm-hmm.
If there's a 1 in 4 chance that anytime I get behind the wheel of a car, I'm going to get into an accident, I'm probably not getting behind the wheel of a car. That's a pretty darn good chance. I think some people would say if there's that much uncertainty, then
why even have a model?
Partly because you can bet on it if you want, right? This is how most things work, right? This is how odds work in the NFL or whatever. What good is having a point spread if the Falcons are ahead by 4 points and we know that the Patriots are going to win X% of the time anyway, right? But look, it depends on what your prior is. If your prior is that the race for the House is a toss-up, then we would say no, it's not a toss-up. There is enough evidence to say Democrats are favored, and you are just being lame. And covering your ass if you can't say that one side has the hand that you would rather play, right? At the same time, you hear, maybe less after 2016, you do hear people say, like, they just assume that this is baked in, and it's saying, no, 25% chance that you're going to have Republicans win instead. I mean, look, I suppose I wish that, like, every forecast could be 100-0, but it's, like, not the way the real world works, right? And it probably shouldn't be the way the real world works when you don't have a lot of information about a lot of House races. Things can change. People have to vote, right? And so if you don't find the whole point of the forecast is the probabilistic part of it. And so if you don't find that useful, then
don't use it.
Yeah, you can find a site that will guarantee what's going to happen. The problem is, no matter how much they guarantee, they're going to be wrong 1 out of 4 years, right? So we offer truth in advertising. And by the way, it's not hedging our bets. It's saying that if you were to play out these conditions 100 times, that Republicans actually would win in 25 of those tests.
All right, let's leave it there. Rush, I hope that answered your question.
I'm not even sure, but look, honestly, I listened to some of that longer segment, and some of it's like, he is saying that Republicans, but that's the point. Like, to me, the reason we kind of go out of our way to, like, emphasize that, right? And you could argue to the point of overemphasis. This is basically a pretty good forecast for Democrats, right? But because for some people, 75% or 3 in 4 doesn't convey that, right? For math geeks like me, when you say 75%, that means it necessarily implies, 25% chance this doesn't happen, and so this thing is a long way from certain. Just in everyday commonsensical activities, things that are only a 75% chance, are things that we would confirm or reconfirm or be careful about and be very unsurprised if they fail to occur. A 25% chance on my subway commute home that it's going to be late, right? For sure. It's probably 40% with the subway being what it is now, right?
All right. We will save the subway conversation for another episode, but that completes the second installment of Model Talk. Nate, it's been a pleasure.
It's been real.
I am Galen Druk. Tony Chow is in the control room. We'll be recording another Model Talk again soon, so send us your questions either on Twitter or at podcasts@538.com. Also, go rate us on Apple Podcasts. Share the love this Labor Day. If you're barbecuing with friends, encourage them to go rate us as well, or tell them about the podcast if they don't know about it. Anyway, that is all she wrote. We will see you on Monday.
Last night, 538 website, Politics Podcast, Galen Druk asking the editor-in-chief, Nate Silver, about his forecast for the 2018 midterms. The question, what odds does your forecast show for control of the House in this election?
It gives Democrats a 3 in 4 chance of winning the House.